I would talk about where does equality and fairness fit in the big society. And I'd just like to throw in a new question at the start, which is, can you build a big society without also addressing inequality? Big society really should be based, I think, has been on trust and mutuality, and all the evidence we know from people like Richard Wilkinson, for example, shows that inequality and trust are not at all correlated. But that's just a question, I think, for me, around where does inequality sit within the big society, which is prior, if you like. What I really want to talk about is, this is an agenda, the big society, that has a lot of resonance with many voluntary and community organisations. I'm regularly invited to come out, and I know Toby is as well, and people say, tell us more about what is the big society. And I think it's because there's both potential there for excitement and to be challenged. There is a lot of perplexity at the moment. David Cameron's sort of definition, if you like, enabling people to come together to solve problems and improve life for themselves and their communities, is probably a good summary of how many voluntary and community organisations would describe what they do. But at the same time, I think that they're also experiencing huge cuts in their own funding, accompanied very often with rising demand in the communities that they work with, and a sense of inequality and unfairness increasing at the same time. And so there is this, if you like, perplexity. There's a language, there's a resonance, there's something that they can feel that they can very positively relate to. But what does it mean? And I think that's something that they're all grappling with, or we're all grappling with. I would say, I think, if you look at the scale and complexity facing many of our communities today, things like climate change, demographic change, social cohesion, I think voluntary and community organisations could and should play a bigger role. And if you look at things like transition towns, that is independent action, people coming together to make a positive difference in their communities, but also to put pressure, I think, on, or at least to create an environment where political decision makers can actually make a positive difference. So I think there is much more scope for voluntary action. Not entirely sure whether that is always the same as or instead of state action as well. And I think one of the key questions going forward is what is the role of the big society? But does it necessarily mean a smaller state or a different state, which I think is one thing that's been talked about before. But I think, as I say, one of the key things is around tackling some of the underlying factors that actually make it more difficult for some communities, for some individuals, to participate on a day-to-day basis. I think that's one of the roles that voluntary organisations actually can play quite well, as not just providing a voice for individuals and communities, but actually giving people the skills, the confidence, the opportunity to speak for themselves. It's also about looking at new ways of engaging with public services and creating a wider range of ways in which particularly vulnerable communities can get involved. So I think we need to think much more about what is it that, if we think the big society is a good idea, and I think there are many ways in which it is a very positive idea, what is needed to sustain it? And I think we shouldn't underestimate, those of us that have been working, before I came to NCVO, in community organisations with a wide range of organisations, we shouldn't underestimate how difficult it is to sustain and to initiate and sustain people's engagement at any level. And actually very often that's best done on the ground. And one of the problems that David Cameron has in defining the big society is at the end of the day it's not really up to him. It is actually up to communities themselves. How do you get that bottom swell up? And how do you do that and ensure that the littlest voices are able to make themselves heard? Because I think unless there is support for a wider range of voices to be heard, simply handing power out could just be reinforcing that it's the same old voices that do get heard. So I think part of it is about building connections on the ground. Part of it is about looking at what is it the communities need in order to actually do more things for themselves. They need financial capital, they need human capital, they need social capital. Many of these things that voluntary organisations can help with. Credit unions, for example, play a really important role in some of the poorest communities, giving people the resources to participate, enabling people to actually challenge decisions. It shouldn't really just be left to poor communities to actually help themselves. How can they challenge those who do have more resources than them to make a difference? And again, I think that's where one of the rubs comes in with the big society agenda. There is a sense in which it's talked about, let's get people engaged, and there'll be this big, lovely consensus, and we'll all have lunch together and we'll love each other. But actually there is an important role in where do the challenges come in, who provides those challenges. If we're talking about promoting social action, then what role for campaigning? And I would suggest that the student protest is the big society in action. And I think that much of the work that voluntary organisations have done have actually led the way in bringing about some of the policies that will make just a bigger society, but perhaps a better society. In the spending review there was lots of bad news, but one of the good news was that international development money was ring-fenced. Now would that have happened without Make Poverty history? That's the question. So I think there are important ways in which voluntary and community organisations can help both to build a bigger society, but also to ensure that it is a fairer society. But it can't do that on its own. It can't do that with without some level of funding. And there's a lot of talk about support for volunteers, but good volunteering opportunities cost a lot to support and sustain. You can't just say, off you go then. It has to be safe, it has to be a positive experience for everybody. And finally, then, therefore, I think it really is about how do we build up from the ground, but how do we do so in a way that is not each little group shouting for their own part? How do we make the big society more than the sum of its parts? And I think there's a really important role for local voluntary organisations working together and working with councils in order to actually build those connections and actually really start to build not just a bigger society but a fairer society. I don't think those two questions should be separate.